Today's lesson centers around succession and the ability of an ecosystem to change with the fluctuation, conditions, temperatures, moisture. We do see a progression that an ecosystem, including the wildlife, the plant species, and how they change over time. So, even this photograph here, you can recognize that on the far left here, there are structures like exposed rock, and on those rocks, lichens can attach to that and start to begin to break it down. And this is a kind of an all-encompassing picture of an area that is undergoing succession. More than likely, you'll never come across something like this before or in your lifetime. But it's trying to show you the progression going from left to right, and how we have early life forms, and then we have forms that can, like the young forest of a poplar, moving into what is referred to as the climax forest, where these are the penultimate types of vegetation that can grow in the area, and would need to be disturbed or removed for other forms of life to invade that area again. So changes in the ecosystem, this is happening, and depending upon the type of plants that are and conditions that are present, will determine the living things that can encompass and take part of that ecosystem. So one of the things we have to consider is a term that we use is referred to as limiting factors. And these limiting factors, as you can well imagine, limit the growth of living organisms. And in other words, they influence it. And so any biotic, meaning living, or abiotic, meaning non-living parts of the environment that restrict the populations from reproducing or inhabiting just different areas of that are referred to as limiting factors. And you can imagine some of those limiting factors in the ecosystem, one of them primarily being water. If there's not enough water for the population or even a single species of plant or animal insects, it's not going to really thrive in that area. It's in fact going to limit the number that can grow in that area. Another one is some of the light. And obviously, we know that our green plants, our autotrophs, require an abundance of light. And so some species have actually adapted to limiting or a limited amount of light. But that's what we consider in the understory of a lot of thick vegetation that's maybe found in some mature forests or like the rainforest or even here in northern Minnesota. So one of the things that we have to look for is the amount of light. Water, light, those are all going to limit the growth of living things in that area. So one of the questions pops up then, what important biogeochemical cycles limits the growth of most producers? In other words, remember we're looking at the carbon cycle, the phosphate cycle, the oxygen, water, those are all going around and being redistributed, recycled within an ecosystem. So, what one would maybe limit some of the growth? Well, one of the ones that stands out is phosphorus. Phosphorus is one of those that plants require and need. And if there are in exceptional higher quantities, the phosphorus amounts in an ecosystem, it can overwhelm an area because of the abilities of those um, aquatic plants to really reproduce and thrive at a point where maybe there's these huge algae blooms as a result of that. But in the right proportions, phosphorus is one of those things that, again, would limit the amount of growth in a particular area. Another term that comes about as we're looking at this is the carrying capacity. In other words, how much that ecosystem, that area can handle. And so the graph that you can see here is a population. And regardless of what we're looking at, it could be the wolf and it could be the moose example that we've given here in class. But the population you can see here from the 1800s to 1925, one of those is what we refer as the carrying capacity in blue. In other words, that's the population that the system can handle without um, overabundance of nutrients or underabundance. It's just kind of the perfect match. So it's the maximum the population can sustain itself in that area. So these limiting factors influence the carrying capacity. So those ideas of food, amounts of light, water, even shelter and other micronutrients like phosphorus would influence this. Predators can influence this. And again, it goes back and forth. So the overall theme here is carrying capacity is if the population here in purple overshoots or goes above that limit, then there'll more than likely be a die-off or removal of for some reason because of some of those limiting factors down below the carrying capacity. And so life is in this balance of going above and beyond, or below, above and beyond those in this particular realm. Another term that we use to describe some of these factors that influence life is the range of tolerance. Now, your book describes range of tolerance as this upper and lower limits that allow for an organism to survive in these conditions. And so the example here is the kind of the optimum zone where these steelhead trout. You can see this large bubble of almost the ideal temperature. So if you look at the temperature on the top, it's 9 degrees on the far left of Celsius and 25 degrees on the far right. And if you look in the middle here, somewhere in here where the red circle is the greatest number of steelheads because of the temperature. They can tolerate lower temperatures, but there's lower number. They can also tolerate higher temperatures, but again, there's lower number. So there is a range somewhere probably, I would guess, in the, you're looking at the 16, 17, 18 degrees Celsius range is where we're going to find the highest degree. Beyond that, we're going to look at the zone of stress. In other words, it's stressing the organism. They don't tolerate that really well. And then beyond that, intolerance. We have all had potential goldfish that just couldn't tolerate the stress or the temperature and passed away as a result of that. Potentially, at least I have. So as you look at this, where would you find the carrying capacity of this graph? Well, obviously, depending upon the temperature, would indicate the carrying capacity for the steelhead trout. So ecological succession, therefore, is a series of stages and steps. And we have some terms that I'll throw out there. One is referred to as the pioneer stage. In other words, if you look at this far left area, you'll notice that there's a lot of rocks and exposed areas, not a lot of, in fact, there is no vegetation. But what you can see is on some of the exposed rocks, some of the plants, they can tolerate these type of conditions and thrive. A lot of those that live on the bare rocks are lichens. And there are some small plants that can thrive in these areas. But think about volcanic eruptions and other exposed areas, maybe in the mountains or even northern Minnesota, that there isn't a lot of soil because of some of these factors that have limited growth. And therefore, it's up to these pioneer plants, pioneer organisms to really break down some of the exposed minerals and rocks and expose and provide more soil. So as time goes on, hence the arrows going from left to right, you'll notice that there are a little bit taller plants, different variations in variety, and then even some flowering plants. Again, as the soil is accumulating over time, and this takes thousands and millions of years to get to a point where maybe the soil is thick enough to provide an area for pine species, which really need kind of a minimum amount of soil, but they kind of expand themselves out. We're referred to as a fibrous root system, versus maybe the king of trees like the oak trees that need a lot of soil, and they embed their roots deep down into the soil as a result. That would be on the far end of the ecological succession, a really mature community. So these changes that are happening happen gradually, and one replaces another. In fact, in Minnesota, you can see several of these really taking shape even currently. And northern Minnesota is a prime example of that. So that, as I said, the first stage of this is called primary succession. First community, no topsoil, and they're creating those for others to follow. Secondary succession is once we've established this soil and nutrients that are necessary. If there's a disturbance like a fire or flood or some other thing, all the topsoil and all the seeds that are already present can establish a community like this mature community at a much faster rate. So again, that's primarily what you want to think about. This thing primary happening maybe after new land has been produced as a result of a volcano, versus millions of years later on that same spot where you have all the soils necessary. A fire comes through and disrupts it. Now we can still maintain some of those species, but it'll occur at a much faster rate than it had prior. So primary succession, you can see here with the lichens and the small plants, the soil formation in this area. Lichens and mosses are historic landmark species for this primary succession. They accumulate the dead matter, and again, over time, provide that first soil. So you can see some of them are growing it here in the lava rocks. Some of the ferns and other forms of plants that don't need, it can vary with some of the necessary soils and content are soon going to be followed. So those herbaceous ferns and fungi are going to follow, along with some of the insects and birds that can follow as well. So here's a nice little area, some of the plains where you eventually see some of those smaller shrubs taking place over those rocks and maybe the intolerant soil where there's very little of it. And then again, one community is building on another. Some communities don't tolerate shade very well, so those plant species or organisms that require big open spaces of land would thrive in these primary conditions. Again, this is just trying to show you some of the, going from the top here where a volcano potentially disturbs the area, moving into the lichens that are going to follow, and mosses, low-growing shrubs and plants, and then finally on the far right-hand lower area here, you have, after many years, soil in place and many of the seeds that are in place to produce a different type of environment from what initially started. Secondary succession, again, as I suggested, usually happens after a disturbance like a fire. In northern Minnesota, in Minnesota in general, we have much of this happening naturally. We have lightning strikes during thunderstorms. We have fire erupting. That isn't necessarily man-made, and clearing out an area where maybe the organisms, plant species that are already there now can begin to thrive because of the necessary light requirements. Remember, some of these species wouldn't grow that are present in seed form, but can't grow because of insufficient amount of light. Now, with a forest fire coming through, some of the proper maybe moisture or light intensities are there for their growth, and they really spring to life as a result of that. So some of those basic things that are now exposed allows other organisms to thrive and continue to build. So that's the secondary succession. And again, the whole idea is, again, these pioneer species occupying these areas, followed by some of these species that require more room, more soil, and maybe even different amounts of moisture, and provides shade for other organisms that occupy those areas as well. Again, going through the succession, it takes time, and there is beginning to be maybe even some higher tolerance of shade trees coming in and establish themselves. Oak trees can thrive in these conditions. Again, they can spring to life as a result of the shade. There's what we refer to as shade tolerant initially, and they can dominate an area, and what we refer to as mature forest following those types of conditions. Again, here's some of the spruce that take over in northern Minnesota, and as a result of these short-lived pioneer species, they're thin with aging processes, and again, they're going to be gradually replaced by some other tree species, like some of the spruces and other pine trees that will begin to dominate that area after these aspen have been gradually replaced. So it's getting to a point where The succession continues until most of these shade tolerant species, like these dominant oak trees and elm trees, um, are forming these communities, which we refer to as the climax community. And these climax communities are kind of the end of the succession. And the only way that they're going to be replaced is by maybe man clear cutting those areas, or maybe a fire or disturbance of some type. And that's what we refer to as the climax species. Unfortunately, with climax species, we don't have a lot of variety and species variations. Insects, large animals, small animals, bird species, it kind of begins to limit the amount of living species within that. So, therefore, disturbances aren't encouraged. And actually, nature has done a really good job of taking care of that. Another example of secondary successions that we can see is that it's man-made, and that's farms. After a farmer, he or she has tilled the soil, we know that if it's not kept tilled and used for crop rotations, these are gradually going to be replaced. The area is by some of these other seeds that are floating around in the atmosphere that are present in the soil, and eventually we can see the maybe in the natural ecosystem reestablish itself over time. So again, the thing with a secondary succession is the soil, the seeds, the moisture, that's all present, and so the reestablishment, it happens at a much faster rate.